It was a picture-perfect evening at the grand estate of Mr. Charles Winslow, a man known for his wealth and unwavering standards. His daughter, Emily, was the light of his life, a young woman full of grace and kindness. But tonight, the air was thick with tension as Emily brought home someone special, a man she hoped her father would accept. Dr. James Carter, a successful and compassionate surgeon, stood confidently at her side, but it wasn't his profession or accomplishments that caught Mr. Winslow's attention. It was his skin color. Without hesitation, Charles made his disapproval clear, dismissing James with sharp words and a cold stare. Emily, torn between love for her father and admiration for James, stood silently, hoping for a miracle. As James left the room, he turned back with a calm, knowing smile. Sometimes, Mr. Winslow, life has a way of teaching lessons in ways we least expect. His words lingered in the air as the door closed behind him. Little did Charles know, the choice he made that evening would set off a series of events that would shake his world, challenge his beliefs, and leave him questioning everything he thought he stood for. As the days went by, Emily couldn't shake the unease from that fateful evening. She had never seen her father so unyielding. Growing up, Charles Winslow had always been a man of principle, but his world revolved around power, status, and tradition. Emily had always respected him, but this time his judgment felt wrong, painfully wrong. Meanwhile, James continued with his life, seemingly unaffected by the rejection. At the hospital, he was admired not only for his skill, but for the way he treated everyone with respect, regardless of their background. His patients adored him, and his colleagues often said, "James Carter doesn't just save lives, he changes them." But behind his calm exterior, James couldn't forget the look in Emily's eyes that night, torn and apologetic, yet filled with hope. Back at the Winslow estate, Charles carried on with his business dealings, confident he had done what was best for his family. Yet small cracks began to form in his seemingly perfect life. Emily grew distant, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet sadness. And then came the moment that changed everything, a call that would bring James and Charles face to face once more, but under circumstances neither of them could have ever imagined. The phone call came late in the evening, breaking the stillness of the Winslow estate. Charles answered, his tone brisk as always, but his face stiffened as the voice on the other end explained the situation. Emily had been in a car accident. Though her injuries weren't life-threatening, she needed immediate surgery to repair internal damage. At the hospital, Charles paced the waiting room, his mind racing with fear and guilt. When the surgeon finally arrived, Charles froze. It was James Carter, wearing his scrubs and a calm but focused expression. For a moment, their eyes met, and Charles felt an unfamiliar twinge of vulnerability. "Dr. Carter will be taking care of your daughter," the nurse said gently, unaware of the history between the two men. James didn't speak to Charles directly. Instead, he turned to the nurse, discussing Emily's condition with the same professionalism and care he offered every patient. As James disappeared into the operating room, Charles sat down heavily. For the first time in years, his power and wealth felt meaningless. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly. As he waited, Charles found himself reflecting on the decisions he'd made, the judgments he'd passed, and the stubborn pride that might cost him more than he was prepared to lose. The hours felt endless as Charles remained in the sterile waiting room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He was a man used to being in control, but now his daughter's life was in someone else's hands, someone he had so quickly dismissed. Each passing second amplified his regret, forcing him to confront a truth he had buried deep inside. Finally, the doors swung open, and James stepped out. His scrubs were marked with the evidence of a long, difficult surgery, but his expression was calm and composed. Charles shot up from his seat, his heart pounding. "How is she?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. James met his gaze, his tone measured. "The surgery went well. She's stable now and resting. We'll monitor her closely over the next 24 hours. Then, with a nod, James walked away, leaving Charles standing there, grappling with emotions he didn't fully understand. When Charles was finally allowed to see Emily, her pale face and fragile state shook him to his core. She opened her eyes briefly, managing a weak smile. "James saved me, Dad," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Her words pierced him deeply, leaving him to question how he could ever face the man who had saved his daughter's life. As Charles sat by Emily's bedside, her words echoed in his mind. The man he had rejected, dismissed without a second thought, was now the reason his daughter was alive. Guilt gnawed at him, but before he could gather his thoughts, the door opened, and a nurse stepped in. "Mr. Winslow, Dr. Carter asked to speak with you when you're ready." Charles hesitated. What could he possibly say to James? Swallowing his pride, he followed the nurse down the brightly lit corridor. When he reached James' office, the surgeon was reviewing medical charts, his calm demeanor unchanged. He glanced up as Charles entered, offering a polite nod. "I just wanted to thank you," Charles began awkwardly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. But before James could respond, an administrator interrupted, handing James a file. "Dr. Carter, we need to discuss this matter with you immediately." Charles watched as James' expression hardened ever so slightly. The file contained details about a malpractice lawsuit, a case Charles's company had recently funded as part of a broader agenda to target hospitals employing diverse leadership. Charles's heart sank as he realized the depth of the consequences his actions had unknowingly caused. The man he had wronged wasn't just Emily's savior. He was also a victim of his own ruthless ambition. Charles stood frozen as the weight of his past actions hit him like a tidal wave. The lawsuit, the smear campaign, it had all been part of a business strategy he had orchestrated to gain leverage in hospital investments. He hadn't thought about the people affected, just the profits. And now, one of those people stood before him, the same man who had just saved Emily's life. James set the file down and looked up, his expression calm but unwavering. "I imagine this puts things into perspective, Mr. Winslow," he said, his voice measured but firm. "You've built your empire by making decisions that ripple far beyond the walls of your boardroom. This time, that ripple almost cost your daughter everything." Charles opened his mouth to speak but found no words. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what his power and pride had wrought. "I didn't know," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. James studied him for a moment before replying, "Maybe not, but knowing now, what will you do about it?" Before Charles could respond, Emily appeared in the doorway, leaning on a nurse for support. "Dad," she said softly, her voice steady despite her frailty, "it's not too late to make things right." The tension hung thick in the air as Charles turned to his daughter, her words echoing the very realization forming in his mind. He looked back at James, who waited silently, and extended his hand, a gesture not just of gratitude, but of apology and a promise for change. James hesitated for a moment before shaking it, but as their hands parted, a nurse interrupted. "Dr. Carter, there's another patient in critical condition. We need you now." James nodded, his attention already shifting to the next life he could save. As Charles watched him walk away, he realized that true power didn't come from wealth or influence. It came from integrity, compassion, and the courage to do what's right. And for the first time in his life, he felt a desire to use his resources not to build his empire, but to build something that truly mattered. In the weeks that followed, life began to shift for Charles in ways he never expected. Emily recovered steadily, her strength and warmth returning with each passing day. Her relationship with James, though still a delicate subject for Charles, became a source of quiet reflection for him. He watched how James treated her, with patience, respect, and unwavering care, and it made him realize what he had almost lost due to his own biases. Charles took his first steps toward change by withdrawing his company's support for the malpractice lawsuit, ensuring that the baseless accusations against James and others would be dismissed. But he didn't stop there. He began reaching out to community leaders and organizations to understand the impact of his past decisions. For the first time, he used his wealth and influence to support initiatives promoting diversity in medicine, education, and beyond. One evening, Charles invited James over for dinner. The atmosphere was tense at first, but as the evening progressed, walls began to crumble. Charles shared stories of his own struggles, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. James, in turn, shared his vision of a world where people were judged by their character, not their background. By the end of the night, there was no handshake, no formal agreement, just an unspoken understanding that bridges were being built. As Charles stood by the window watching Emily and James laugh together in the garden, he felt something he hadn't in years. Pride, not in his wealth, but in the man he was becoming.